I'd like to start this review off by disclosing the fact that I've been using the MateBook X Pro from Huawei, yeah I know it's kind of a weird name, as my daily driver for just over 2 weeks now. It replaced my 13-inch MacBook Pro base model, the 2017 edition, as you'll find it compared to the MateBook in almost every single way in this video. I think the juxtaposition is a fair one though, because they're not only equitable in terms of price, but they're like copies of each other. Well, I should say Huawei copied Apple when it comes to the design, but they definitely improved many things across the board, and we'll talk about those in this video. So here it goes, the Huawei MateBook X Pro review. Now at first glance you might be thinking, okay, yeah, they definitely ripped off the MacBook's design here. The dimensions of both are nearly identical. I'm talking length, width, height, whatever you want to look at. Slim faux speaker grills surround the keyboards. There are even 2 USB-C ports on the left side of each. Granted, only one on the MateBooks is Thunderbolt 3 and chargeable. But what makes the MateBook truly great are its improvements elsewhere in the design and function of the laptop. For instance, it's difficult to overlook this beautiful, nearly bezel-less display. Capable of up to 450 nits, it rivals the brightness of the MacBook. The color gamut here is also pretty incredible, not quite on par with the MacBooks in terms of Adobe RGB, but nearly 100% sRGB. I noticed neither oversaturation nor backlight bleed, and the 3000 by 2000 resolution brings with it a pixel density of 259, a clear step up from the 2560 by 1600 13.3-inch 227 ppi density of the Retina display. With these dimensions comes a slightly taller aspect ratio for the MateBook than traditional 16 by 9. You'll find 3 by 2 here, meaning you'll see black bars in pretty much any widescreen video you watch. I more than welcome the extra real estate. You don't have black bars when you're surfing the web, when you're content creating, and I'm fine with that. Other aspects of the screen are satisfactory as well. The LTPS technology yields excellent viewing angles and a decent contrast ratio. Oh, and did I mention it's also, a touchscreen, and that's something the MacBooks have never had. This is a clear step up from the 13-inch Retina panel in every regard that I can think of, so a great job Huawei with this display. But a near bezel-less form comes with quirky function. You know what I'm talking about here, the camera, right? Where is it, you ask? Is it here? Nope. Is it here? No. Is it what Dell does with the XPS 13s? Is it down here somewhere? The answer is still no. It's actually right here in the keyboard. That's right, a click release key of sorts hides an upward facing 1 megapixel sensor with of course terrible low light performance, as you might expect, along with putrid viewing angles. I'm not even sure this really qualifies as 720p, not that the MacBooks is any better. It's so sad to see a MacBook Pro with such a terrible camera, but now that Huawei's also doing it, I really can't talk the MacBook anymore for it. What's up? This is a test of both the camera quality as well as the mic sensitivity and quality. I'm about 2 feet or so away from the screen, and of course I'm looking down at the camera because it is below everything I see above it. So if you want to look at content on screen, this is what it will look like to someone watching you on camera. Your eyes are going to be significantly higher than the person that you're actually trying to talk to via the camera. But a convenience factor associated with Huawei's take is that it can be securely stowed into the keyboard tray, meaning that you don't have to worry about unwanted spies snooping in on, well, whatever you happen to be doing. No more tape tinfoil hat wearers. No, but in all seriousness, cam hacking is a serious and a real thing. It's happened before many times, and this design mitigates the issue altogether. So all in all, I would trade optimal camera placement for extra screen real estate and this camera stow function any day of the week. I also enjoy watching companies tackle the camera placement issue in different ways. This is by far the most unique I've seen in an Ultrabook. More on the build quality, it's very similar in feel to the MacBook, surrounded by solid aluminum on all corners, although the MateBook's feel is just a bit smoother. So the MacBooks has a more rough aluminum texture. This one might be a bit more slippery, just something to keep in mind. Chamfered edges make the MateBook look pretty majestic AF in my opinion, and the sturdy hinge is still subtle enough to be opened with one finger, and it actually won't wobble too much either when being pressed with a finger. Remember, this is a touch panel. I hate this about other laptops in the Ultrabook category. They always seem to wobble whenever you push it. This one, of course, if you give it some force, is going to do that, but I don't think that it's a major concern if you're just kind of tapping something or sliding up and down, you're not gonna have too much wobble at all. I do find the trackpad a bit lacking though, definitely a downgrade from the MacBook, though any laptop is gonna be a downgrade from the MacBook in terms of the trackpad. If anyone's doing it right, it's Apple in this regard. I'm not gonna dock them for it at all. So the two physical buttons on the MateBook's touchpad here on the bottom left and right side are a bit loud and difficult to push, though you could just tap with your finger instead, albeit without any physical feedback, and I think that's the part that I miss the most with this little haptic engine here on the MacBook. You feel it wherever you push just because of the motor embedded into the touchpad itself. Other than that, the MateBook is pretty large, taking full advantage of the gap beneath the keyboard, and it is fairly precise. It'll detect even the smallest of movements with your finger. By the way, don't confuse the MateBook X with the MateBook X Pro. You want the Pro model, but there are two versions, the i5 and the i7, and you want the i7 Pro model specifically. We'll discuss why here shortly, but next let's talk about the MateBook keyboard. Now you're probably assuming it'll be difficult to adjust to thanks to the slim profile, yet only MacBooks really suffer the fatal key switch flaw thanks to that butterfly design, which really wasn't corrected the second time around. The third time around supposedly fixes the issue, but this laptop here does not have third gen butterfly switches. We're still on second gen, and that's a huge problem because Apple actually doesn't even fix the issue by implementing a third gen switch when you send it in for repair if something stops working. It's all discussed in this video right here, by the way, if you're more interested. Now, fortunately, the MateBook X Pro, though copying much of Apple's design cues, stayed away from such dangerous switches in favor of more traditional, mushy keys. Yeah, I know it sounds weird to promote such bland tactile feedback because there's almost literally none in this chiclet style keyboard, especially when seen in the context of mechanicals, right? But for an Ultrabook, I'd put this on par with maybe like a Dell XPS 13. They aren't great, but they're better than what you'd expect from this form factor, and that's all I'm really worried about. They also won't break on you 3 months into use, so there's that. Another cool feature just above the keyboard is a fingerprint scanner, and it's embedded into the power button. It's fast with Windows Hello and much easier than chugging a PIN or password. Just takes a bit of getting used to pushing the button versus typing in a PIN if that's what you've been doing for the longest time. Less than a second of hold time even while sleeping, and you'll be signed in automatically. Up next, I want to discuss drive speeds. This i7 unit comes equipped by default with a 512GB PCIe-based NVMe SSD. These reads and writes almost line up with this thing's screen resolution, oddly enough. So a blazing fast 3GB per second or 3000 megabytes per second for reads, 2-ish gigabytes for writes. You'll find that it competes almost neck and neck actually with the MacBook counterpart, and I've really never had anything bad to say about modern Apple drives. Windows loads from a cold boot in about 8 seconds, games fire up instantly, and best of all, no unwarranted hard drive noise, which is not something you should expect anyway with most Ultrabooks. I recommend, by the way, opting for the higher tier storage model, not just for the i7 and GPU. Half a terabyte is kind of the bare minimum I would recommend for a laptop of this caliber. Any less, and you may find yourself upgrading drives in the future, at which point you should have gone with a larger drive to begin with, right? And saved yourself the hassle of transferring the operating system, important files. Yeah, it can be a mess sometimes. Now on to other relevant internal specs, starting first with the CPU. This is the Intel Core i7-8550U, a Kaby Lake R quad-core packing a 15-watt TDP and boost clock of 4 GHz. It should be noted that this turbo frequency is rarely attained though under intense workloads. During Adobe Premiere workloads, for example, average core frequencies level off around 3 GHz instead. That's still not bad though for a quad-core hyper-threaded ultra-low power chip. Now in the performance department, this thing actually excels. A score of 529 in Cinebench is a huge step up from the lowly dual-core i7 ultra-low power CPUs from days past. That's what's in this MacBook, by the way. They did step it up recently, but still, no discrete graphics, and that's a deal breaker for me. Geekbench scores reveal strong single-core performers despite reduced clock speeds under load, and a modest multi-core score thanks in large part to hyper-threading in this scenario. This translates to solid Adobe Premiere Pro renders, which when paired with the MX150, which I'll talk about in a second, amount to a respectable 10 minutes for a 5-minute 4K video file. I'm not even joking, 10 minutes with this machine here. That is unheard of. Most Ultrabooks take 30-40 minutes to render a 5-minute 4K video file at about 40 megabits per second, so this is incredible. We aren't even far off the mark of lower-end desktop-grade CPUs with much higher TDPs. Our Achilles heel here is definitely the small chassis and the thermal limitations associated with it, but if portability is a top priority, that's what an Ultrabook is for, then this one is one of the best in the business. Now let's move on to the MX150, an NVIDIA GPU included in the i7 variant of the MateBook X Pro. It's the one I'd advise you buy for only a couple hundred USD more than the 8GB i5 model without discrete graphics. And that's a deal breaker. Again, I recommend the D GPU. It's a huge step up in almost every regard. The MX150 packs a heck of a punch in such a small form factor, nearly doubling the OpenCL performance of the i7's integrated UHD 620 graphics, according to our Geekbench runs. In fact, watching these two GPUs tag team via QuickSync in Premiere Pro is a pretty phenomenal process, partly explaining our low render times we saw earlier. The MX150 can game too, now not at the native resolution obviously, but modestly with 1080p in low settings. I'm talking specifically about PUBG here, which isn't buttery smooth from an optimization standpoint anyway. We're looking at anywhere between 35 and 50 FPS in the very low preset at a resolution slightly higher than 1080p actually, because we have a 3:2 aspect ratio. It's 1920 by 1200 if we don't want the stretched image. But if you're more into Fortnite, let's say, the MateBook X Pro still churns out just under 60 FPS on average. Again, these aren't incredible numbers relatively speaking, but watching a laptop the size of a 13-inch MacBook Pro turn out playable frame rates in modern battle royale titles is pretty incredible if you ask me. Now, temperatures across the board were also fantastic to my surprise. The fans kick on fairly early, but they aren't loud by any means. Go ahead and have a listen. So yeah, definitely quieter than some of the beefy gaming laptops on the market. Do keep in mind though that this GPU only sports 2 gigs of VRAM, so bumping any game settings in softer titles will be a challenge. That's assuming that your GPU though isn't already the bottleneck, which in most cases will be the case. Now, a few other things I'd like to briefly mention. Battery life is excellent. I'm hitting around 9 hours in my use, which, whoops, is pretty heavy, and about 10 hours when playing back 4K Netflix at 50% brightness. That's also really incredible for a laptop of this size. The speakers also sound great. There are 4 of them, 2 against the keyboard edges, along with 2 larger ones down below. The range is excellent, sounds are undistorted all the way up to max volume, and the bass is very present. Go ahead and have a listen to these. Not as much of a kick as the MacBooks, which I think are still the best. If you listen to them in person, it's a little difficult to kind of translate this across a microphone. The MacBooks sound a bit clearer, but the MateBook X Pro speakers get significantly louder. So if that's a concern to you, this one is definitely the louder one of the two. And again, at minimal distortion, so these are actually pretty high quality speakers in a laptop, again, in this size. I also failed to mention the ultimate selling point for the MateBook X Pro, USB Type-A. That's right, we actually get a single Type-A port on the right side of the chassis. There's barely enough space for it, but Huawei made it work. With this, you can connect a gaming mice, wired headsets, phones, pretty much anything that isn't super new. So the things I love about this laptop, just to recap here: the great screen, discrete graphics embedded, and the slim profile. Things I think are kind of meh, not deal breakers, but things I would like to see improved in the future. The camera, which is actually down here, the keyboard, and the trackpad. I wouldn't say they're deal breakers again, just things that do need improvement. Now, for my workloads, the MateBook X Pro is just a massive jump in the right direction, especially when compared to the MacBook 13-inch model. I've been using Final Cut Pro with the MacBook, and it's very well optimized for this software for Mac OS. But again, you can only get it on Mac OS, and that's a compromise for quite a number of people out there. If you're interested in Adobe Premiere Pro, more like solid rendering on Windows 10, which is used by quite a number of people, then I think this is one of the best Ultrabooks in its class. Hands down, it's about $1,500, but I would choose this over like a Dell XPS 15 for around the same price, because it does come with that MX150, and that makes a world of difference. You can find this product linked down below, along with a few other Ultrabooks kind of similar to this one. I know Asus has an Ultrabook with a discrete chip in it, but I like the build quality of this one better. I like the screen better on this one, and you get the 512 gig SSD, right? The 16 gigs of RAM by default with this model. So now I want to hear from you guys in the comments down below. If you think that the Huawei MateBook X Pro is a step in the right direction for Ultrabooks, let us know. If you disagree with anything I've said in this video, maybe the opinions I've expressed based on some of the specs that we've listed, then let's duke it out. I'm totally open for that, right? I know that Apple fanboys are gonna creep their way into here, and I'm sure they're gonna have things to say about the Huawei being a solid copy. Nobody can do things better than Apple, that's why they copy them, blah, 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 but whatever. Ultimately, Huawei has improved what Apple should have already improved in their MacBook 13-inch models, and they've managed to cram a discrete GPU in here at the same time. Again, an infinity edge display almost, from similar to what Dell does with the XPS 13s, discrete chip, a mediocre trackpad, a weird camera placement, excellent battery life, a price that's comparable to a MacBook 13-inch model that's significantly weaker in many respects. It's hard to bargain with an Apple laptop when you have this in your corner. So give this video a thumbs up if you thought it was cool, dislike it if you feel the complete opposite, or if you hate everything about life. You guys can click that red subscribe button if you feel like getting fancy with it. You can also sponsor us or join. That's basically your way of paying us money. I don't know what YouTube's gonna call it eventually, but it's gonna change from sponsor to something else soon. If you're already a sponsor and you wanna keep sponsoring us, don't worry about it. Nothing will change on your end. You'll still get the icons, the badges, the support, and live streams and what have you. Anyway, thanks for that support. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.